everyone. Welcome to the 10th TIU Global Dialogue session, Economic Fallout of the COVID Crisis, Emerging Economy Challenges. My name is Sojin Shin, Assistant Professor of Political Economy at Tokyo International University. As of today, the official death toll from the COVID-19 pandemic has reached 3.8 million, and over 176 million cases were reported worldwide. Although advanced economies have managed to fight against the crisis, many emerging economies have struggled substantially with low income levels, high population densities, weak medical infrastructures, and limited policy space. Today, we invited Dr. Duvvuri Subbarao, former governor of the Reserve Bank of India, India's national bank, to discuss emerging economies' challenges to the pandemic. We are very delighted to interact with him, a distinguished former civil servant from India. Dr. Subbarao served as governor of the Reserve Bank of India for 5 years from 2008 to 13. Prior to that, he was finance secretary to the government of India from 2007 to 8, and secretary to the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council from 2005 to 7. As a career civil servant in India for over 3 decades, and as a lead economist in the World Bank for 5 years, Dr. Subbarao acquired vast hands-on experience in public finance management. Dr. Subbarao holds a master's degree in physics from the Indian Institute of Technology, Kanpur. He studied economics at the Ohio State University and later at MIT. He has a PhD degree in economics from the Andhra University in India. Subbarao's book, Who Moved My Interest Rate, chronicling his experiences in leading the Reserve Bank of India through 5 turbulent years, is best known for the way he explained the policy dilemmas and challenges facing an emerging economy central bank in a globalized world. After stepping down from the Reserve Bank of India, Dr. Subbarao was a distinguished fellow at the National University of Singapore and most recently at the University of Pennsylvania. Before I welcome him to the screen, I would like to request our audience to leave questions and comments on the chat board so that the speaker can answer the questions at the Q&A session. Also, the audience is welcome to ask questions directly to the speaker after his talk by using the raise hand function. Please give a brief self-introduction before the questions as well. Without further ado, I welcome Dr. Subbarao. Please welcome him. Dr. Subbarao, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Sojin. I want you all to think of one thing. In 25 years from now, what will you tell your children about the COVID crisis? What will be your most vivid recall of the years 2020 and 2021? If you're from a rich country, your story will probably go like this: that life was on an even keel. We thought medicine had conquered all communicable diseases. No. Okay. If you're from a rich country, your story will probably go like this: that life was on an even keel. We thought medicine had conquered all communicable diseases. Then something strange happened. The strange virus hit us. Life shut down. There was lockdowns. We all went back home. We stayed home. It was a strange experience. There was fear, anxiety, panic. But we could adjust. Within 8 months to 10 months, they discovered a vaccine. We got vaccinated, and within 2 to 3 years, life returned to normal. Now imagine a 25-year-old woman from an emerging economy, Bangladesh or Peru or Ethiopia or Cambodia, What will her story be like to her children? Her story will be like this, that we migrated from our village to the city for work. We were doing manual labor. It was difficult, but we were making enough money. It was better than in the village. We could feed you. We could put back some money for savings. We could put you in schools. Then this strange disease hit us. We lost our incomes. We lost our jobs. We lost our livelihood. We had to go back to the village. Life in the village was even worse. We'd gone back into poverty. Lots of people in and around our village had succumbed to COVID disease. And but for the pandemic, our life would have been better, and your life would have been better. You see that difference between those two stories. The story of the rich country woman is recall of a health crisis. The story of the emerging economy woman is a recall of an economic crisis. The story of the rich country woman is of life returning to a normal, perhaps a new normal, but a normal nevertheless. The story of the emerging economy woman is of life returning to a subnormal, permanent scarring by the pandemic. That difference in lived experience, that contrast in lived experience between emerging economies and rich countries is what I want to communicate to you today. And the central message I want to drive is this. For emerging economies, this crisis is deeper and will be more prolonged than is commonly believed. Why? Because of high population densities, poverty, weak medical infrastructure, limited policy space. In order to drive that policy message, I'll be addressing two questions. The first question is this: how is this crisis different from previous financial crises? And understanding that is important to understand why the challenges of managing this crisis are more complex for emerging economies. In doing so, I'll draw upon my experience as the Finance Secretary of the Government of India and as the Governor of the Reserve Bank of India to relate to you the policy challenges and dilemmas. So let me turn to the first question. How is this crisis different from previous financial crises? First, it's different in terms of the origin and transmission. The world has seen several financial crises over the last 40 years. We had the Latin American financial crisis in the 1980s, we had the tequila crisis in Mexico, and the Asian financial crisis in the 1990s. We had individual country crises in Russia, in Argentina, in Turkey, and of course, the global financial crisis in 2000s. There's an important difference between all those earlier financial crises and this economic and financial crisis triggered by COVID-19. That difference arises from where the crisis originated. A typical financial crisis originates in the financial sector because of excesses, because of pressure built up in the financial system. For example, the Asian financial crisis, of which all of you must have studied, that was a consequence of Asian economies running fixed exchange rates, maintaining high interest rates. Consequently, a lot of hot money had come to Asian economies. And when the tide turned, that money left suddenly, leaving behind a crisis, a devastating crisis. The transmission of that crisis was from the financial sector to the real economy. In contrast, the COVID crisis originated not in the financial system, not in the economic system, but because of a virus outside the financial and economic system. It first hit the real economy and then hit the financial sector. This difference is not just textbook issue. It has practical implications for policy. In a typical financial crisis, governments and central banks are in the forefront, squarely responsible for restoring normalcy. On the other hand, in this crisis, governments and central banks are just doing a holding operation because the lasting solution to the crisis has to come from medical science. Until that comes, governments and central banks are doing just a holding operation. And doing that holding operation is much more challenging for emerging economies. Precisely for the same reason, that this crisis is different. There's much more uncertainty in this. Uncertainty is a defining feature of every crisis. Every financial crisis over the last 40, 50 years has had uncertainty. But the uncertainty in this crisis is very, very unusual because people are concerned, anxious, uncertain whether the virus has come to an end, when there might be whether vaccines are effective, when there might be herd immunity, whether there'll be a third wave, fourth wave, etc. And if there is such uncertainty, people do not participate in economic activity. They do not produce unspent. Consequently, economic activity goes into a vicious cycle. And this uncertainty is particularly more sharp for emerging economies for obvious reasons, because they're much more concerned, they're much more threatened by a second or third wave, etc. And the third difference between a normal financial crisis and this crisis, and this is interesting, is that the interventions in the financial sector and the real economy are conflicting. In a typical financial crisis, governments and central banks are trying to repair the financial institutions, resolve failing banks. At the same time, they're trying to revive the economy by supporting consumption, by making transfer payments to people, by supporting production, by providing support to production units. And the economic activity gives a positive feedback to financial activity, and the financial sector gives positive feedback to economic activity, and there's a positive feedback loop, and the economy gets onto a virtuous cycle. But what's happening in this crisis? On the one hand, governments and central banks are trying to revive the financial sector. At the same time, by imposing lockdowns and restricting economic activity, they're trying to restrain the economy. So these two things, what governments and central banks are doing in the financial sector and what they're doing to the economy, are conflicting. And finally, the final difference between a normal financial crisis and this one is the perverse multi-speed recovery. Multi-speed recovery is quite common in all regional and global financial crises. For example, after the global financial crisis, emerging economies recovered much sooner than advanced economies. But in this crisis, the reason I say it is perverse multi-speed recovery is because advanced economies are recovering much faster than emerging economies. This is not entirely bad, because if advanced economies recover, it's also good for emerging economies, because advanced economies provide support they provide export demand. They provide support for tourism, etc. And they give remittances. Commodity prices will go up, and commodity exporters among emerging economies will benefit. But at the same time, there is uncertainty too because of the multi-speed recovery, because if rich countries recover, the costs of borrowing for emerging economies will go up. So multi-speed recovery has both positives and negatives. So I want you to understand these differences between a regular financial crisis and this crisis in order to appreciate why the challenges of managing this crisis are more complex for emerging economies. In particular, I'm going to talk about 5 challenges. I'll give you just for half a minute to go through this. Okay, let me turn to the first challenge. Sophie's Choice. Some of you may have seen this movie. Many of you might have heard about it. Sophie's Choice is a movie that came out in 1982. Meryl Streep was one of her first movies. She got an Oscar for it. The story is about Sophie, a Polish Jewish woman with 2 young children. She was captured by the Nazis, taken to the Auschwitz concentration camp, and the Nazis give her a choice. Which of her 2 children will go to the gas chamber, and which other child will go to a labor camp? That's a gut-wrenching choice for any mother to make. In this pandemic, governments are having to make a similar choice in balancing the tension between lives and livelihoods. All of you understand this. If countries have to save lives, they've got to lock down the economy, which means livelihoods are lost. On the other hand, if they show concern for livelihoods and allow economic activity to go on, allow physical activity to go on, lives might be lost. So managing the tension between lives and livelihoods has been a sharp dilemma for all countries, all governments, has been much sharper for emerging economies. Why is that so? Rich countries, for example, they ordered lockdowns in order mainly to control transmission. In emerging economies, governments ordered lockdown mainly with the motivation of gaining time to ramp up medical infrastructure. In rich countries, people could adjust because most people are employed in the service sector. Service sector jobs can be done from home. There's work from home. People could adjust. Their incomes did not fall. They had savings to fall back on. The government supported. On the other hand, in emerging economies, people lost their lives, livelihoods, lost their incomes, lost their purchasing power, ran down their savings, because most of them are employed in contact-based jobs. In India, for example, my country, the most enduring memory of this crisis was about 40 million labor in the urban informal sector trudging back home from the cities to the villages, braving hunger, thirst, heat, exhaustion, etc. last summer. So this conflict between lives and livelihoods and managing that has been a much sharper challenge for emerging economies. The second challenge is providing safety nets to the poor, where to find the money. We all understand that during this pandemic crisis, governments have been called upon to support consumers, to support producers. For that, governments need money. How do governments make money? They either have to tax or to borrow. In a situation like the pandemic, it's not possible or appropriate to tax people more when people are already suffering. So the only alternative is to borrow. In rich countries, governments could borrow because they had fiscal space. The cost of borrowing was not very high. They had enough space to borrow and to withstand the cost of borrowing. And they borrow in hard currencies. Everybody in the world is anxious to lend to rich countries. America, for example, the Trump stimulus was $0.9 trillion. The Biden stimulus was $1.9 trillion. That's together $2.8 trillion, about 15% of American GDP. America can do that because America issues debt in dollar, which is a hard currency which everybody is craving. On the other hand, emerging economies, markets are much less generous to emerging economies. If the governments borrow, the costs of borrowing will go up. If they borrow in the domestic economy, interest rates will go up. If they borrow in the overseas markets, there's concern about exchange rate risk. So governments find it difficult to borrow. And then there's the issue of how can they avoid a debt trap? Because when governments borrow, they have to repay that money. And a rich country like America can repay that money. But when emerging economies and developing countries spend that money on providing consumption support to their people, economic activity is not generated. If governments borrow and spend on building infrastructure, building public goods, which supports production, that then it supports growth, and the governments will earn enough money by way of taxes to repay the debt. But if government is actually giving money to consumers, how do they repay the debt? The burden of debt will pass from us to our children. The question is it fair to sin against our children? That takes me to the third challenge for emerging economies, which is how to keep confidence in the economy from crumbling. A crisis is a time when the confidence of producers and consumers in the economy is shattered. And it is the responsibility of the governments and central banks to revive confidence, stimulate confidence. How do they do that? By restoring price stability, by restoring financial stability, by restoring exchange rate stability. And how do they do that? We've seen central banks around the world, governments around the world. What do central banks do? They cut interest rates. They pump an enormous amount of liquidity into the system by what is called quantitative easing. That is a mechanism for inspiring confidence in the economy. That works in rich economies because their markets are deep and mature. Emerging economy central banks do the same thing, but it does not work in emerging economies so efficiently because our markets are shallow. The terminology for this is that monetary policy transmission is much weaker in emerging economies. Also, when central banks reduce interest rates and inject so much liquidity into the system, there's concern about inflation. Rich country central banks can say that they are not worried about inflation. But emerging economy central banks cannot really do that because inflation is always an existential concern. And most importantly, exchange rate. If emerging economies borrow in overseas markets, they have to pay back that debt in foreign currencies. But all this capital which is coming into emerging economies because of quantitative easing by rich countries, if that leaves suddenly, as it might happen, if America, Europe, even Japan reverse their policies, all the money that's come into emerging economies will reverse and go back. Suddenly, there will be an exchange rate crisis in emerging economies. Their debt burden will go up, their exchange rates will sink, and their competitiveness, their economies will be trapped. So the challenge is how to prevent or how to restore confidence in the economy in the midst of extreme anxiety and uncertainty. That takes me to the fourth challenge, which is how to make sure that banks continue to be safe even when loans are not repaid. We know that during the pandemic, because of lockdowns, production has stopped. Consequently, production units which have borrowed from banks are not able to repay. Consumers have been hit. Consumers are not able to repay their loans. Banks, as we all understand, are in the business of financial intermediation. They take money from depositors and lend to borrowers for economic activity. If the borrowers do not repay money, what do banks do? Banks go under. So governments and central banks to prevent banks from failing. So if governments and central banks are to prevent banks from failing, who bears the cost? The cost is borne by the public. And that cost is much more in emerging economies because people are poor. So that's the fourth challenge, which makes managing this challenge much more sharp for emerging economies. And finally, the fifth challenge, how to contain the social turmoil arising from sharpening inequalities within and between countries. We all understand inequalities. Inequalities between countries, inequalities within countries. This is not a new phenomenon, it's been there all along. But over the last 25 years, some things have happened. Inequalities within countries have deepened, both in rich countries and poor countries. But inequalities between countries have converged. But this crisis, triggered by the COVID-19 pandemic, is going to reverse that. Inequalities both within countries and across countries are going to get much sharper. You all understand that even in rich countries, there are inequalities. You heard of that famous book by Thomas Piketty, Capital, which is about inequality in rich countries. The Trump phenomenon. Trump came on the political scene because of bitterness of the lower income groups in rich countries about the inequalities. But this crisis is going to sharpen inequalities between rich countries and poor countries, and between rich people and poor people within the same country. Why? Let's take the case within countries. What's happening? When central banks, as I've said earlier, inject liquidity, there's a lot of money. The expectation is that that money will go into productive activity. But if production units are not willing to borrow, if consumers are not willing to borrow, that money goes into pumping up asset prices. So consequently, paradoxically, India, for example, even as economy is contracting, the share market is booming. Share prices are going up. Asset prices are going up. Real estate prices are going up. Equity prices are going up. Who owns the assets? Rich people. On the other hand, poor people are seeing a loss of their incomes, loss of their purchasing power, loss of their savings. So rich people are seeing a positive wealth effect. Poor people are seeing a negative income effect, and that clash is creating social turmoil. Again, the health crisis is sapping productivity. And if productivity is down, people cannot produce, they cannot earn. And that hurts in poor countries because the burden of disease is much higher. Education. In rich countries, they could teach children online. In emerging economies, online education is going on, but it's not of such high quality. So there's a concern that children might have permanently lost some educational input. Women are going to suffer. There's any amount of evidence to show from the World Bank and from the ADB that women are going to suffer much more in this crisis. In India, for example, unemployment today is double of what it was last year. Poverty. There are some studies to show that more than 100 million people have been driven back into poverty. The World Bank studies show that the effort of the last generation in reducing poverty might be reversed because of this crisis. So this crisis is sharpening inequalities, is creating a social turmoil between people within countries, between rich people and poor people. Now, what about inequality across countries, between countries? We are all aware of that rich countries, America, Europe, are recovering. America's GDP this year is going to be higher than the GDP 2 years ago before the pandemic hit us. On the other hand, many emerging economies may not even reach their output level of 2 years ago. Poverty levels have increased, unemployment rates have gone up. And vaccination. Rich countries are able to vaccinate. Vaccination percentages are very high. On the other hand, in poor countries, vaccination is quite slow, quite low. In Africa, it's not even taken off. So there's a lot of social turmoil, social strife arising out of this sharpening inequalities within countries and between countries, and that's going to leave a long-lasting scar on emerging economies. So I've spoken to you about 5 challenges that are going to be quite existential, quite sharp for emerging economies to drive home the message that for emerging economies, this crisis is deeper and will be more prolonged than is commonly believed. And one last thing, you might ask, why should you care about this? You should care about this because no country in the world can prosper until every country in the world prospers. We cannot have a world where one part of the world is prospering, the other part of the world is deteriorating. Rich countries have prospered over the last generation because poor countries have prospered. If poor countries go down, it is not possible for rich countries to continue to prosper. So, to ensure that the whole world recovers from this pandemic crisis and recovers to a durable growth path is important, not just for emerging economies, not just for developing countries, but even for rich countries. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Subbarao, for the very clear and insightful talk. Audience, please feel free to raise your hand for the questions and comments, or you can use the chat board. We have received a question from one of our TIU students from the DBI, the Department of Digital Business Innovation.
Yes, recently I saw it in the CNN news. I think in America the Fed has been like printing money a lot compared to like previous years. So I think it's because of the America trying to give out money to its citizens in order to avoid them suffering financially. And I want to know how is the influence of this COVID crisis on the inflation in different countries.
Mm-hmm.
For example, in like poor or like rich countries, inflation.
Okay, thank you. Where are you from, by the way?
I'm from Uzbekistan.
Oh, I see. Thank you. Thank you for your question. Dr. Subbarao, would you like to collect some more questions?
Yes. Yeah, sure. Thank you, Jakungi. That's a very good question. Like you said, the Federal Reserve, as well as ECB, the Bank of England, they're all printing money. They're all printing money and pumping that into the system in order to revive confidence. Part of that money is going to support government borrowing. As I've said in my presentation, America is launching a fiscal stimulus of $2.8 trillion, which is about 15% of American GDP. The Fed is not directly financing the government, but the fact that Fed is printing so much money and doing quantitative easing is helping the American government borrow at lower terms. You're right that the downside of this is inflation. There's been talk about the American Biden stimulus and the Trump stimulus actually igniting inflation in America. The Federal Reserve can say that we don't much care for inflation. At the moment, our priority is actually to revive growth. And the markets will accept it. What is happening because of all this quantitative easing by America and Europe is that because that money is not absorbed there, it is coming into emerging economies like India, Indonesia, Thailand, Philippines, Mexico, Argentina. And it is pushing up asset prices. It is pushing up retail prices there. So the fear is that the printing of money and the quantitative easing by American Federal Reserve, they can withstand the negative impact of that, whereas the negative impact is falling mostly on emerging economies, and they will be hit by inflation, they'll be hit by exchange rate crisis. For example, when all this hot money goes back, there'll be volatility in our markets. And because of that volatility, there might be exchange rate depreciation. So emerging economies have gone through this experience several times in the past. They have to be prepared for this. So yes, you're right. Because of financial globalization, what America does has an impact on emerging economy exchange rates and inflation.
Thank you. Ali is also our TIU student from the Department of International Relations. Ali, would you like to ask your question?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, so thank you so much, Dr. Subbarao, for a great presentation, very insightful. I'm a student from Professor Shin's class, and my question to you, basically, I'm from Pakistan. My question to you is that in my country, what I've seen in my country, due to COVID, there is an elite sector, and then there is a sector that's not so literate. So these people who are not so literate, and they do not believe in this COVID as a thing as a whole, like they do not believe in this thing. So how do you tackle these problems? How do you make these people convince these people that this is actually something that's going to danger you and put you at harms? Because these people are not educated at all, and they think that it's not even a real thing, and these people live in houses where you just have to do something to make money, and you just can't live. You know what I mean?
Of course I do. Yes. Thank you, Ali, for that question, because I can relate to what you're saying. India and Pakistan is similar. There is a small minority of population which is quite well off. There is a large majority of population which is poorly off. And this tension between lives and livelihoods, which is a dilemma for all governments, is much sharper for emerging economies, especially emerging economies in South Asia, because of our large population densities. As you yourself have observed, most people are employed in the informal sector. Most people are employed in contact-based jobs. If governments order lockdowns in order to control transmission, in order to ramp up medical infrastructure, that's fine. But the cost of doing that is that livelihoods are lost. As I said, in India, 40 million people have traveled back from cities to villages last summer because they've lost their livelihoods. And they may never recover fully, as I've said at the beginning of my presentation. I expect the same is true in Pakistan as well. So there are no easy solutions for countries like ours. The immediate priority is to ramp up medical infrastructure, get people to accept vaccination, ramp up the vaccination drive, and educate people COVID appropriate behavior, and at the same time, understand their concern for their livelihood. Governments, especially in emerging economies, can support their people only to that extent. They cannot continue to give as much money as America is giving. So there are limitations. So governments have to tailor policies to control the pandemic on the one side and also allow people to earn their livelihoods. It's a difficult challenge, it's an unusual challenge, it's an unprecedented challenge, but I have no definitive answers to how this can be done except by persuasive leadership.
Yeah. So what can I ask one more small question? Is that okay?
Okay, quick question, Ali.
Quick question. So me being a 25-year-old individual, what part can I play myself?
Excuse me, what?
I said me being a 25 years old individual, what part can I play?
What part can you play? Oh, Ali, that's a wonderful question. You can play a part by spreading awareness. You are a 25-year-old, you have a full life ahead of you. You're getting educated in one of the best universities in the world. And if you go and tell your countrymen, your country people, I think that will have a much greater impact on, in your community, in your society, in your village, in your town. So the part you can play is to spread positive awareness about this crisis, about this disease, how people should respond to it, and to encourage them as well. That's the part you can play. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Subbarao. The next question is also from our IR student, Matthias. Matthias is asking the first question, how do you think that US-China trade war will affect the financial crisis? And he is thinking whether or not the easing of sanctions would be helpful for the economy in the future. And second question from him, well, will this financial crisis affect India attitudes toward China and BRI? Would you like to respond to the question?
Thank you. Yes, I would like to, although this is not my domain. Trade wars, trade tensions predate the pandemic. We've lived with them for the last 6-7 years, ever since Trump had come on the scene. The US-China conflict had deepened. And everybody said that trade wars are bad for US and China and for the rest of the world. The concern was to repair the trade war, repair the differences, and see that there is a minimal consensus on conducting trade, because trade is good for everyone. But countries have to adjust to the negative impact of trade. Rich countries have to adjust, China has to adjust, emerging economies have to adjust. Unfortunately and disappointingly, the pandemic has, in some sense, sharpened the bitterness in rich countries against China, both because of the concern that the virus originated in China, and also because of the impact of China lockdown, because China has been the center of global supply chains. So if China's economic activity comes to a halt, global activity comes to a halt. So in some sense, the crisis is a big illustration of the lived experience of the impact of China on the world and the impact of China-America trade tensions. My only hope is that when this pandemic is behind us, and I hope that is soon enough, that we will understand why it is in our collective interest, not just the interest of America and China, but interest of all of us in resolving this trade wars and seeing that we agree on a code of conduct in international trade. Now, your second question is about the bilateral conflict or bilateral interface between India and China. Again, this is a historic legacy. India-China conflict goes back to 50 years. It's been simmering, but over the last 5-7 years, it's come back to the forefront again. And there's been some actual skirmish on the border over the last 2 years, which is bad for India and probably bad for China as well. And there is certainly resentment in India against China, as indeed there might be resentment against India and China, I don't know. But certainly in India, there's resentment about China, about the border skirmish, about China's trade practices, about China, how the trade balance between India and China is getting imbalanced in favor of China. I have for long said that as much as India can have a grievance against China, China's edge over India is not entirely because of trade practices. China's edge over India is also because of China's improved productivity. So as much as we must urge China to be a good global citizen, India on its part must also try to improve its productivity so that it can compete with China. So the answer to your question is that it's going to sharpen the tension between India and China, but I also hope that the experience of the crisis will pave the way for bridging the tension.
Thank you for the insightful answer. The next question is also from our IR student, Antoinetta. The question is, there are several instances of countries that are successful in tackling the COVID-19 pandemic and the crisis following right after. I guess my country, Korea, South Korea is one of the models, and the Korea's K-quarantine model is gaining popularity. Antoinetta is asking, do you think it is possible for developing countries that are struggling to deal with the pandemic to implement the same framework and model? If so, how could it be implemented?
Thank you. I'm not very familiar with the Korean model, but I do certainly know that Korea holds up a positive example for the rest of the developing world of what can be done. I have enormous respect and regard for what Korea has done, not just in this crisis, over the last 50 years, okay, what Korea has done. There's a lot to be learned from Korea in managing this crisis, for example. But as I said in my presentation, and as I said in response to Ali's question earlier on, managing the tension between lives and livelihoods is a much sharper challenge for countries which are a little lower in income levels than Korea. Korea can order lockdowns because people have enough savings to fall back home. People can work from home. They can make the adjustment. In emerging economies in developing countries, that adjustment is much more difficult. So, of course, we should certainly see what we can learn from from Korea, and how we can adapt from the Korean model to our own countries. Thank you.
Okay, may I ask a question, Dr. Subbarao? I understand that your appointment as the RBI governor was made in 2008, which was a very hard time when the global financial crisis took place. And I understand that good economics are needed for hard times. But I believe that good governance is also, or perhaps more, important to endure the hard times. Well, I want to ask you about your experience working with the political leaders, the political elites during the hard time. You worked in the Congress UPA government, and you experienced the three different finance ministers, Manmohan Singh, Pranab Mukherjee, and Chidambaram. What do you think the most important thing that political leaders should consider in tackling the financial crisis? And would it be their leadership or knowledge or teamwork with the technocrats like you?
Thank you, Sodin. And all of the students, you must know that your professor is very familiar with India. So that's a very good question. On the first point, you're absolutely right. That as much as good economics are important to resolve a crisis, good governance is also very important. And that has become quite clear to us just from the Q&A session over the last 20 minutes. The questions people have asked about is not just rolling out money and cutting interest rates or injecting liquidity, but it is making sure that right policies are implemented effectively so that help reaches to the right people in the right time. That requires good governance. And that is, we're talking, of course, today in the context of the crisis, but good governance is important all the way. Because people believe that, that economic development growth is just a matter of good economics. Good economics is necessary, but not sufficient. You need good governance. Take, for example, this issue of ease of doing business. Some of you might know that the World Bank comes out every year with this index of ease of doing business in each country. And I think Switzerland or Norway or Denmark or Singapore, they rank among the top countries. In Korea too, might be somewhere up on top there. Whereas emerging economies in developing countries rank at the bottom. Even though we implement good economic policies, doing business in India, doing business in emerging economies is difficult because of poor governance. Poor governance is not just corruption. Poor governance is indifference, incompetence, the selfishness. So corruption is just one part of good governance, bad governance, but there are lots of attributes, characteristics of bad governance. So I continue to hold very strongly that as much as economic reforms are important, governance reforms are very important. And that leads me to answer the second part of your question, which is political leadership must give importance to governance reforms. In India, we've recognized that not just this government, even the previous government, with different rates of success across successive governments. But now there is clear understanding that unless we make investment and doing business in India a promising opportunity, a promising endeavor for emerging economies, we cannot prosper. And that's the emphasis that should be placed by emerging economies. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for your suggestion. The next question is from our IR student again, Ishan Huang. She is from China. Ishan?
Yes, I have one question about under this COVID situation. I know the Japanese government send the cash to the resident who losing their job to support their family, but like in another hand, the government also raised the tax, and so like it somehow made the resident complaint about it. So what do you think about that?
Thank you, Ishan, for the question. I think I partly referred to that in my presentation, which is that governments need to spend more in this crisis. For that, they need more money. How do governments raise more money? Either by taxation or by borrowing. In rich countries like America, they said they will not tax anymore. Most countries have not resorted to taxation in order to finance COVID-related expenditure. You just told me that Japan has decided to tax. Perhaps Japan believes that they've already borrowed enough. Japanese government is one of the most indebted governments in the world. Debt to GDP in Japan is about 250%, as opposed to in America is about 110% debt to GDP. In India, it is about 70%. So Japan government must have determined that the government has already borrowed too much. And if they borrow further, the burden of repaying that money is going to fall not on this generation, but on their children, that it is not fair to do so, that today's rich people must bear the cost of coming to the support of today's suffering people. That's the idea of taxation. Japan has made that decision. Most countries, certainly most emerging economies, cannot tax more in this situation. That's why they resorted to borrowing, and I think that's the right thing to do. I don't know what China has done. You're familiar with China, probably, Ishan, but most emerging economies have decided to borrow more rather than tax more.
Thank you, Dr. Subbarao. I think Subin, our graduate student, asked a very similar question about how emerging economies can provide the stimulus package, though the emerging economies that they can afford for that. The next question is from our IR student, Hannah. Hannah is asking the question for countries depending on tourism. What are their alternatives for the economic recovery?
That is very true. India is not, unfortunately, disappointingly, we're not a big tourist destination in terms of world tourist destinations. So I don't have much experience, but I do know that countries such as the Maldives, Singapore, Thailand, Mexico, they get a lot of tourism revenue. And they have been affected by the crisis because tourism involves travel. Travel has been shut down during this crisis. Tourism involves contact-based services like restaurants, hotels, etc. They have been shut down during this crisis. So countries which are dependent on tourism have lost much more, have been affected much more in this crisis. As I said, because I don't have much experience of tourism, I cannot really prescribe what they should do. But the solutions are quite obvious, I believe, that as soon as travel resumes, they must open tourist facilities in such a way as to assure both domestic and foreign tourists that the tourist destinations and the services around tourism are all conforming to COVID-appropriate behavior to inspire confidence among prospective tourists that they're not threatened by the disease if they come for tourism. In fact, I think this is the appropriate time to do that because rich countries are opening up. There's a lot of pent-up demand. People are tired of sitting at home, so they might want to travel. So this is the time for countries dependent on tourism to aggressively clean up their tourism sectors, make it COVID consistent, and promote their tourism.
Okay, thank you. The next question is also from our IR student, Jasper. Jasper is from Taiwan. He asks, well, can rich people support the policy of recovering the crisis? I think he is thinking rich people are the beneficiaries somehow from the COVID pandemic.
Rich people, did he say rich people?
They are the beneficiaries. Jasper, would you like to elaborate your question? Are you there? Jasper?
Hello.
Yes.
Oh, so Dr. Subbarao, I have a question about so can like the rich people, for example, in my country, Taiwan, there's like a really rich entrepreneur who like told the public like he is gonna, for example, purchase the vaccines from overseas in order to benefit Taiwanese people to make them, recover faster from the COVID-19 crisis. So I wanted to ask you if this is a efficient way for to have rich people supporting other policies in order to make the country recover faster from the crisis.
Yeah. Thank you, Jasper. First, I want to acknowledge that Taiwan is another country that's managed the pandemic in an exemplary way, like Korea. It illustrates an example of how a pandemic should be challenged. So I want to congratulate you for your country. Now, you've cited examples of rich people in countries like Taiwan coming to the support of people who are suffering. That's certainly an appropriate thing to do. It is, if you ask me, is this a substitute for governments doing something? I don't believe so, because the responsibility is primarily on the governments of supporting the poor people, of supporting the people who are suffering. To the extent the rich people through their private efforts can supplement what the government has done, certainly most welcome. But I would hope, I don't know about Taiwan. Taiwan is a relatively small country. But in a country like India, if there are some rich corporates, rich entrepreneurs, rich people who want to support the government's effort, I would request them to consult the government beforehand about what they should actually be doing. Because there's just no point deciding that, look, I believe that the need for the country's ventilators and getting, millions of ventilators, we might have a surfeit of ventilators. So as much as the rich people joining the endeavor of managing the crisis is very, very helpful, it'll be good if they coordinate their effort with the effort of the government for it to yield maximum efficiency.
Thank you. We have two more questions again from our IR students. The first question is a follow-up question. The student is asking, well, the people, they understand that the stimulus package will be helpful, but people are at the same time complaining about that. So what do you think about the people's complaining about the government stimulus package policy?
Is that question about India or about emerging economies in general?
I think in general.
Okay, yeah. I can quite understand people complaining that the support that the government has given is not enough because poor people have borne the brunt of this crisis. As I said in my presentation and several times for the past 1 hour, they've lost their livelihoods, they lost their incomes, they lost their savings, they lost their purchasing power. Governments have tried to support them. But you must understand that there are limitations to what the government can do. If the government borrows a lot of money to support poor people today, it's got to repay that. And who will repay? It is not that the government can print money and generate money for repaying that. Government has to earn taxes to repay that money. But if the money that is borrowed today is spent on consumption, government will not get much by way of taxation in order to repay that loan. So the burden of loan will fall on future generations. So this question is always there, but particularly sharp during this crisis, which is it fair for governments to borrow to support today's generation and pass on the burden of repaying to the children? Should we sin against our children? So people will complain against stimulus package. Those complaints are genuine, but governments have to make a judgment for how much they can borrow and go to the support of people who are suffering today.
Thank you. The next question is from Lisonia. She is from Guinea-Bissau. She's our graduate student. Lisonia, would you like to ask a question directly to the speaker?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, thank you so much, Professor Shin. Thank you so much, Dr. Subbarao, for your wonderful presentation today. So my question, I think, is fairly along the lines of what we have just been discussing. I know that a lot of developing and emerging economies just don't have the fiscal capacity to stimulate their economies. And in fact, some of them right now are having to choose, like you said, between saving lives now or paying debt that they have racked up previous to the pandemic. And without paying these debts, they run the risk of further damaging their credit ratings. So what do you think the way forward is, given that most countries, one, are afraid of the repercussions of applying for any sort of debt relief, again, with their credit ratings? So we should or should not forego the debt payments?
Are you asking if there must be a debt relief package?
No, I'm saying that I think that most countries right now are in Africa, for example. I know that some countries have been debating whether or not to pursue debt relief packages because of the fact that it can damage their credit ratings for
Sure.
future borrowing.
Sure. Yes. Thank you, Lisonia. That's an issue that we've not discussed, but thank you for raising that, which is that if governments borrow, they're crowding out the private sector. In an economy, there's only so much money to be borrowed. Even if they're borrowing from outside the country, there's only so much a country can borrow from outside. Both the public sector, which is the government, and the private sector compete for those resources. Ideally, the government should restrict itself to providing public goods and allow the private sector to borrow and invest and produce. But in a crisis time like this, or indeed even in normal times, governments do have to borrow, but they have to be very conscious of the fact that if they borrow, they're crowding out the private sector. And that crowding out impact can be much more in a situation like this. But I do believe that at a time like this, governments have to veer towards borrowing more rather than borrowing less. In part because the demand for loans from the private sector is low. So the governments can borrow in the market without raising yields very much. So in making that judgment, government should be biased towards borrowing a little more than borrowing a little less. But as you rightly observed, as soon as there are spring shoots of recovery, government should withdraw and allow the private sector to take on the responsibility and the burden of driving economic activity? Thank you. That's a good question.
Thank you, Dr. Subbarao. We have 4 or 5 more questions, but I will just read out all the questions left, so you can choose whichever you would like to respond. The first question from our IR student, Jufei Kao. Why could China economy recover quickly after the COVID-19 pandemic? The second question is from Naoki. She is asking, when you are talking about the terminologies, uncertainty, risk, danger, crisis, how would you define those terminologies? Third question, again from Matthias. He is from Sweden, asking a question. Can we encourage developed countries to contribute to the global economic recovery for the developing countries? And last question is from our IR student, Miat No. Miat No is from Myanmar. My question is that can Myanmar improve the economic conditions in the future? That's all.
Thank you. Those are lot of questions. First about China. China has done quite well in recovering from the crisis much sooner than most other countries. In fact, China is the only large country, possibly the only country to have actually clocked positive growth in 2020. China was lost in terms of output, but Chinese economy did not contract like most other economies in 2020. And this year, China is going to be the fastest growing economy like it's been over the last 30 years. So in terms of loss of output on a long-term basis, China has suffered much less. I'm restating your question. The answer is, I'm not very familiar with Chinese policy, but I think China has had more policy space, both in terms of fiscal policy, monetary policy, regulatory policy, to revive the economy much more than other countries have. So we must also study, in fact, actually how China has managed this crisis. Part of it is, of course, Chinese governance model, but it's also Chinese economic model. The second question I did not get very well, but let me go to the third question about whether rich countries can contribute to support poor countries. Of course they can. Where's the doubt about this? And it's a question of what mechanisms should they use to support developing and emerging economies. One way of doing that is to go through multilateral institutions such as the World Bank, the ADB, the African Development Bank. The other is to provide support to the IMF for a special drawing rights so that poor countries have more SDRs. The third is through private efforts. There are foundations around the world. Individuals can get together, like the Bill Gates Foundation, or even, supporting vaccines. There's COVAX facility for rich countries to contribute to, so that poor countries can ramp up their vaccination drive. So this certainly is possible. And I think world leaders, G20 leaders, are engaged in how to ensure that rich countries, which are better off, are providing support to poor countries. And as I said earlier in my presentation, they should do so not as a matter of altruism, but as a matter of self-interest, because it is for their own good. Last point I want to say on this, that earlier this week we had the G7 summit. I was a bit disappointed to see that there was not much of discussion on the point you've raised, which is that how can they support the poor countries? It's disappointing that they've not talked about it. The last question about Myanmar, it's again another country, it's a fascinating country, but it's a country that I'm not familiar with. Myanmar has had problems historically. It's having some political and security problems right now, but I do hope that the country will come out of it and come back into the global system soon enough so that it can participate as an equal member of the global system.
Thank you very much, Dr. Subbarao. I'm really sorry for keeping you longer than our schedule, but I would like to invite my colleague, Professor Juno Kim, for his question. He has raised his hands for a long time.
Yeah.
Dr. Subbarao, would you mind taking?
No, of course not. I'm most welcome.
Okay, thank you. Professor Kim?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Subbarao, for your great presentation. And I'm very honored to participate in this great meeting. Thank you. And my question is, this pandemic economic crisis is, a kind of, a real sector crisis. And in 2008, we have the Lehman shock, which is the financial crisis. But I think that this time, this real sector, this pandemic crisis is more serious than the previous crisis in India, okay? So my question is that I believe that in India, there are so many big financial centers, such as Mumbai exists. And I think that Indian economy is quite a lot, interconnected to global financial market. But I never heard that India was attacked by the 2008 financial crisis so seriously. So I'd like to hear from you that what is the reason? So then that means that in India you have very great monetary or financial governance, which is beyond the European or American economic. Or interconnected to global financial market. Okay, and so can you explain that?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, thank you, because you're drawing a contrast between the challenge of the global financial crisis to India as against the challenge of this pandemic to India. India was affected by the global financial crisis, certainly much less so than rich countries, even less than other emerging economies. But we did pay a heavy price in the global financial crisis. I know personally because I was the governor at that time. We had suffered because of capital flight, exchange rate depreciated in a volatile manner. The growth rate went down. Inflation came down. Then we recovered fairly quickly. Inflation went back up. Inflation went back to record levels. Exchange rate went back up and then went back down again due to the taper tantrums. So India did suffer because of the global financial crisis. But I believe that India is suffering much more in this crisis, in part because of all the reasons that I mentioned earlier in my presentation, which is that this is not just a normal financial crisis. This is a health crisis. And India's medical infrastructure is quite weak. India's population density is very high, which is inimical to a communicable disease like this. So resources are limited. Government's fiscal room is quite small. So managing this crisis has been a much bigger challenge for India than managing the global financial crisis. Hopefully, this will be behind us soon and we learn our lessons. Hopefully, there'll be no more pandemics, but if there are, that we learn lessons from this crisis to minimize the impact of future crises. Thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your clear answer. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Subbarao, for sharing your wonderful insight and also engaging interaction with the audience today. Well, throughout the session, I was feeling like sitting in a good economics class. Before closing today's global dialogue session, I want to quote India's Finance Minister, Ms. Nirmala Sitharaman. In this year's budget speech, she said, "Now, just as it had happened after the two world wars, there are signs that the political, economic, and strategic relations in the post-COVID world are changing. This moment in history is the dawn of a new era, one in which India is well poised to truly be the land of promise and hope." And she quoted Rabindranath Tagore's poem Fireflies, saying, "Faith is the bird that feels the light and sings when the dawn is still dark." I hope all the emerging economies that have endured the pandemic are the birds feeling the light soon to navigate the difficulties. Our next global dialogue session will have Dr. Timothy Wittek, who runs the Central Intelligence Sharing System of the United for Wildlife Task Forces with the support from Prince William. Dr. Wittek will talk about geopolitics and global wildlife trafficking, Africa, China, and transnational organized crime. The details of the session will be announced shortly on our Facebook page, IR at Tokyo IU. Please join us next month again and stay healthy. Thank you very much all. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Subbarao.
Thank you very much, Sophie. Thanks very much. Bye.